So good morning, welcome to the Breakfast 10. So this morning's session was a 4 by 1600 meter run test. Now, some of you will have done this before, others may not have. It's a really good predictor of 5K pace, and that's the reason we do it, because it's a little easier to stay focused on a 4 by 1600 than it is to actually stay focused 4 or 5,000, particularly if you're running it by yourself and not in a race situation. The other issue too is often in race situations or on uneven terrain or there's hills, or alternatively people can get in the way, and so it's often very difficult to actually get exactly the sort of accurate numbers we're looking for. A 4 by 1600 allows us to get accurate numbers. It also allows a way to teach athletes to pace themselves effectively. So if you're an athlete yourself, it's a good way to learn to pace a 5K well, or pace the sort of feeling of what it should feel like. Also, from a coaching perspective, it tells us a lot about what's going on with the athletes. Plus, if we're doing it on a track, it gives us a chance to see the athletes run, get some video and look for things like that are going to be biomechanical in nature, or running form and technique issues that we can then work on down the track to actually improve the overall performance of the athletes. So the 4 by 1600 is a really good test, gives us our 5K predictors. And so normally you would do it fresh, so you get accurate, like max F at 5K. That's not always possible. So this morning we did, and the athletes were fairly fatigued. Plus we have a lot of smoke in the air here in Colorado at the moment, so it was a difficult test. So the results were a little less than you would naturally expect on a normal one. But I was really pleased with it because it gave me a chance to look at the mechanics of the athletes, how they were performing form-wise, and just to see where they're at relative to the season as far as overall fatigue resistance, and their overall performances. So you'll see as you go through what we're looking for in the 5K, how to sort of pace it, and then, the 4 by 1600 and how you're trying to pace it. But then you'll also see how you actually go about using that to predict your 5K, and then from there, how to actually use that information down the track and how often you would normally do that. So, what does the session look like from a data standpoint from a session like that we did this morning with 4 by 1600s? Well, essentially, what you see here on the screen is pretty much what it looks like. If you did get the pacing right and you get things set up correctly, then you should see an even pacing across all four of them. If you went out too fast, generally athletes will tend to blow up in the last section. So, if you're an athlete, try to hold the first like 1600 about 90% effort, maybe 95. So that way you can build through the set. You can keep them relatively even. You'll be surprised, even if you go out a fraction slower, you'll probably find yourself running a pretty good time in the first one, which will help set you up for the last three. The goal is always to try to have the highest average speed, and I'll explain why that is later on. But when you can have the highest average speed, then this gives us a pretty good predicted average pace for a 5K, or if we were doing a raced 5K. It's a little easier than doing a 4 by 1600 than actually going out and burying yourself for a 5K, but this does give you a good starting point. So in this case here, so we can see here, if we come across and look at the averages, last one here, coming through at 5:04 for the mile. So if we take that as an average and we move that across into a running calculator or something like that, we can get a pretty accurate idea of what a 5K time would be, and from that give us a relatively good predictor of, say, a 10K time or a half marathon time. So we can actually start to extrapolate out from the data we get from a session like this morning's more accurate information, which makes a huge difference in the long term. So now that we have an idea of the 4 by 1600, looking at times, and we go and take that time. So in the case of our athlete this morning, let's take 4 by 505 as a pacing. If we take those and we put them in the calculator, we get a 505 all the way through, which gives us an average. So if you take that 5 average, or 505 average, you get a predicted 5K time of around 15:53. Bearing in mind we are at altitude, so the times will be a little slower for us, but at sea level, for most of you guys who are working with athletes or are athletes yourselves, when you're running at those sorts of speeds, you can get an idea of your predicted times for a 5K. And that comes in really handy because we know with most athletes that if you have a predicted 5K and we have a normal regression rate, so a normal regression rate for most athletes is around 6.5%. So for every doubling of distance, we slow down by a certain percentage. For most athletes, it's around 6.5%. We do another test usually to determine what an actual regression rate is for a lot of athletes, and you'll see that in future videos as I do more of these. But certainly for a beginning, if you just work on 6.5%, that's a good starting point. So if we have that and we look at this and we know what our predicted 5K is, then we can get an average or a predicted pace for all the distances right up to a marathon or even beyond if we wanted to, depending on overall fitness and fatigue rate and things like that. So, but this gives us an idea. So an athlete who runs, say, a 15:53 would have a 10K of around 33:19, would have a half marathon time around a 1:13 or 1:14 sort of pacing based on a normal regression rate. Now, for an athlete who is a little slower, let's say we have an athlete who is going to go closer to, say, a 7-minute time for their miles, but with the same sort of regression rate, then that's going to put the average for a 5K at, say, a 22-minute 5K, which was then going to put your 10K out to 46:25, half marathon out to an hour and 43. And so you can actually start to use this information really effectively with your athletes and yourself, just in order to predict where you're at and how you're progressing. You can also use it as a fatigue test where you do a bike first and then do, say, a 4 by 1600 run test on the track to give you an idea of a fatigued 5K, which then you can then interpolate in through to determine your sort of 10K half marathon sorts of times off a fatigued bike. But there'll be more on that later on as well, just looking at how we go about doing that. So you can be a more informed athlete and understand things better. And from a coaching perspective, you can monitor the progression of your athletes as you move through and perform with them. Hey, so that was the morning's 4 by 1600. It actually went really well, and I was quite surprised with the conditions, the smoke and things like that, that it went as well as it did. Overall, I would normally do this test about every 4 to 6 weeks, and it depends where you are in the season. So if you're in a base period, you may not do it as often because you're looking for different things. You may not necessarily be looking for maxed out speed. So it's a good test to be using sort of early season to actually get an idea of where you're at, set zones and things like that. It's also a good one as you go through the season to get an idea of how to predict what sort of paces you should be running. You can do it fatigued, like I said in the video, where you actually do the session off a brick. So you do the bike first and you do the run, and that gives you a fatigued 5K. That won't change your fatigue rate or the percentage that you have, which we'll cover later on, but it does change the actual pace of the 5K. Of course, with fatigue, you can run a little slower, and it's going to vary depending on how hard you push that bike and how fatigued you are going into the set. But it is a very, very good set for that purpose. So overall, every 4 to 6 weeks, you put that test in. It's a good way to get an idea of where you're at, see how you're progressing, to see your form, look at your technique, and overall, as a coach, it's a really good sort of tool to have in your toolbox as far as sort of sets you can do, and it also doubles as a really good training session. Likewise, as an athlete, it gives you a really good idea of where you're at, how you're going. It gives you an idea of being able to predict if your training is going in the right direction or if you're moving in the right direction. Likewise, it gives you a way of sort of getting an idea of how you should pace yourself on race day, what sort of times you should be looking for, and how to get the most out of your racing. So thanks for tuning in for the Breakfast 10. I'll see you again tomorrow.